Night falls over Skinwalker Ranch, and one structure sits alone in the dark. No lights, no movement, just a weathered homestead that, on paper, looks like nothing at all. But investigators kept coming back to it. Over multiple seasons, across different teams and different experiments, one location on this 500-acre property kept pulling attention away from everywhere else. Not because of a single dramatic event, because it kept happening again. Skinwalker Ranch has dozens of documented sites, mesas, drilling zones, open pasture. Investigators had their pick of anywhere to point a camera or a sensor. So why did Homestead Two, a modest building with no obvious history of anything extraordinary, become one of the most closely watched locations on the entire ranch? This isn't a documentary about proving what's haunting it or what's hovering above it. It's about something harder to dismiss, a pattern of scientific attention that built up quietly, investigation after investigation. One early field test raised a question nobody could close. Later, far more advanced equipment came back to ask it again. And eventually, Travis Taylor found himself looking at data from multiple independent sources, all pointing in the same uncomfortable direction. But that's not where this started. Homestead Two wasn't even supposed to matter. Skinwalker Ranch is 500 acres of competing theories, mesa activity, drone anomalies, underground drilling that never quite explained itself. Homestead Two had to compete for attention like everywhere else. Early on, it didn't win that competition. Investigators approached the ranch the way any research team should, by following what the data showed them, not what they expected to find. A site earned repeat visits. It wasn't granted them. So the first work done at Homestead Two was closer to a baseline check than a serious investigation. Set up equipment, record what's there, move on to the next site, except the readings from that first pass didn't fully close out. Nothing dramatic. No smoking gun, just enough left unexplained that closing the file felt premature. That single loose thread was enough to put Homestead Two back on the schedule, not as a priority, but as a location worth checking again. What investigators found the second time is where this gets harder to explain away. The team's goal at Homestead Two was simple: establish a baseline, set up standard monitoring equipment, record for a fixed period, and see if anything stood out against normal ranch activity. Magnetometers went down first, then a basic RF receiver tuned to scan a wide range of frequencies rather than search for anything specific. Nobody expected a result. That's the point of a baseline. For most of the recording window, nothing did stand out. Flat readings, normal background noise, exactly what you'd expect from an empty field at night. Then the RF receiver picked up something in a narrow band that hadn't been there before. Brief, but distinct enough to log. On its own, that's not remarkable. Stray signals happen constantly, especially near ranch equipment, vehicles, or nearby radio traffic. So investigators did what any careful team would do first. They ruled out the boring answers. Was it a vehicle passing on the highway? Timing didn't match. Was it interference from their own gear? Equipment was checked and cleared. Local radio traffic, weather-related atmospheric noise, a loose connection somewhere in the rig? Each one was tested. Each one came back negative. None of that meant something extraordinary had happened. It meant the ordinary explanations, one by one, had stopped being available. What the team was left with wasn't proof of anything. It was a signal they couldn't source, on a night nobody had flagged as unusual, at a location nobody had prioritized. That's not a conclusion. That's a reason to come back and bring better instruments next time. Back at the command center, nobody was celebrating. Travis pulled up the RF logs from Homestead Two and started where every good scientist starts, trying to make the signal disappear. Equipment drift was first. Sensors can wander over time, especially in extreme temperature swings, so he checked the calibration history. Nothing unusual there. Environmental interference came next. Could something in the ground, the weather, or nearby structures explain a signal like this? Reasonable, but unconfirmed. Then human error. Had someone walked past with a phone, a radio, a vehicle? The activity log showed no one nearby. Each explanation chipped away at the mystery. None of them finished the job. That's an uncomfortable place for an investigation to sit. Not proven strange, not fully explained either. So the decision wasn't to declare a discovery. It was smaller and more disciplined than that. Schedule another visit to Homestead Two, not because something extraordinary had happened, but because nothing ordinary had fully accounted for it. What nobody expected was how soon that second visit would be justified by an investigation that had nothing to do with Homestead Two at all. A season passed before anyone came back to Homestead Two, and when they did, nobody was chasing that RF signal. The objective this time had nothing to do with equipment drift or unexplained frequencies. Investigators were expanding excavation work across the ranch, and Homestead Two happened to sit inside the new perimeter. Laser scanning went in. LiDAR mapped the terrain in detail no one had captured before. Thermal cameras ran across multiple episodes, tracking heat signatures across the property overnight. None of it was designed to test the earlier mystery. It wasn't even on the agenda. And yet, episode after episode, the footage, the scans, and the crew's own attention kept drifting back to the same patch of ground. That's worth sitting with for a second. Two completely different investigations, planned for two completely different reasons, months apart, and both of them independently treated Homestead Two like it mattered. Nobody on camera connected those dots out loud, not yet. But if you're paying attention, you're already asking the question the investigators hadn't said out loud either. Why does this one location keep absorbing resources that were never meant for it in the first place? That question was about to get a lot more expensive to answer. One data point can always be argued away. Two independent systems agreeing is much harder to dismiss. That distinction is what changed everything about how Homestead Two would be studied next. Repeating the same RF scan a third time wasn't going to settle anything. A skeptic could always point to the same instrument, the same crew, the same possible blind spots. What the investigation needed wasn't another attempt. It needed corroboration. So the approach shifted from watching for something strange to designing a system that could catch it from multiple angles at once. LiDAR would map the terrain in 3 dimensions, precise enough to flag physical changes a human eye might miss. Thermal cameras would run continuously, logging heat signatures across the site rather than spot checking them. RF monitors would stay active throughout, not just during a single test window. Synchronized cameras were positioned to cover angles no single lens had captured before. None of these instruments depend on each other. That's the point. If a thermal anomaly shows up at the exact moment the RF monitor logs something unusual and a LiDAR scan registers a discrepancy in the same window, that's no longer one reading open to interpretation. That's multiple unrelated systems reporting something at the same place, at the same time. Nobody knew yet whether that would happen. But for the first time, Homestead Two was about to be watched by more instruments, more carefully than at any point in the investigation's history. And every one of them was about to be running at once. By this point in the investigation, one thing had become clear. Another single observation wasn't going to move this forward. What the team needed was convergence, a moment where several unrelated systems, none of them depending on the others, were all recording the same location at the same time. So before the ceremony at Homestead 2 even began, the setup looked different from anything used there before. LiDAR units were positioned to catch any physical or spatial anomaly across the site. High-speed cameras ran at frame rates fast enough to catch movement the human eye would miss entirely. RF monitors stayed live throughout, not just during a scheduled test window. Thermal imaging tracked heat signatures continuously. EEG monitoring was added for the first time, watching for physiological responses in the people present. And back at the command center, every feed was being watched in real time, not reviewed after the fact. Here's why that matters. A single camera can glitch, a single sensor can misfire. A single reading on its own is always vulnerable to a simple explanation. But 5 independent systems built by different manufacturers measuring completely different things don't fail in the same way at the same moment. Not usually. That's the entire point of this setup. It wasn't designed to catch something paranormal. It was designed to make coincidence a much harder argument to make. Nobody in that command center was expecting a ghost. They were waiting to see whether unrelated instruments would tell the same story, or whether, once again, the story would fall apart the moment someone looked closely. It didn't take long to find out. The ceremony had barely started when the RF monitor picked it up again, 1.6 gigahertz, the same frequency that had shown up months earlier on a completely different night, for reasons no one had been able to close out. Travis recognized it immediately. This time, though, there was a way to test it further. Sam DeRiso swept a directional antenna across the site, watching for where the signal grew strongest, rather than simply confirming it existed. The reading pointed back toward Homestead 2. So Travis didn't wait in the command center. He picked up a handheld spectrum analyzer and walked out toward the homestead itself, trying to isolate the signal closer to its apparent source, to see if it held up under closer scrutiny or disappeared the way these things often do. At almost the same point in the investigation, the thermal feed showed something else, a hot spot forming gradually over the same structure, with no obvious source. Nobody called it out as connected, not yet. It just went into the log alongside everything else. After the ceremony ended, the EEG data came back for review. The post-ceremony readings didn't match the baseline recorded earlier that night. Nobody claimed to know why. It simply meant the numbers needed a second look, not an immediate answer. That second look happened days later, inside one of the Homestead 2 buildings. The wireless EEG connection dropped repeatedly every time the participants stepped inside. It reconnected the moment they walked back out. Once could be a hardware fault. So the team swapped headsets and ran it again. Same result. None of this proved anything on its own. RF, thermal, EEG, 3 separate systems, 3 separate teams reviewing them, none aware of what the others had flagged until later. The question Travis was left with wasn't whether any single reading was real. It was whether three unrelated systems had just described the same event from three different angles, or whether that was simply what coincidence looks like when you're watching closely enough to notice it. Travis went back through the footage a second time, but not instrument by instrument, this time by the clock. Laid out that way, the sequence looked different. The ceremony begins. Minutes in, the RF monitor picks up 1.6 gigahertz. The directional antenna points it toward Homestead Two. Travis walks out with the spectrum analyzer while the signal is still active. Around that same window, thermal imaging shows a hot spot forming over the same structure. Days later, follow-up testing inside that building produces the EEG dropouts, twice with two different headsets. None of those instruments were measuring the same thing. An RF reading and a thermal signature and an EEG dropout aren't the same kind of evidence. And treating them as interchangeable would be sloppy science. But timing is its own kind of data. And what the timeline showed wasn't one event captured 5 ways. It was 5 separate observations using 5 different methods clustering around the same location within the same investigative window. That's not proof of anything supernatural. Travis was careful never to call it that. What it is a much harder thing to write off as coincidence than any single reading on its own, which is exactly why Homestead Two didn't get closed out after this investigation. It got prioritized for the next one, which raises the only question left worth asking. If no single explanation accounts for everything on that timeline, what does? Let the pace drop here for a moment. Because after 5 instruments, 2 seasons, and 1 very specific timeline, the real question isn't whether something strange happened at Homestead Two. It's this: what explanation actually accounts for everything on that list? Take the RF activity first. Radio interference is common enough on any large property. Equipment, terrain, distant broadcast towers can all produce readings that look unusual before you understand the source. That's a strong, ordinary explanation. Its weakness is simpler than people expect. Investigators didn't dismiss it because it was impossible. They kept testing because they hadn't yet confirmed it was sufficient. Then the thermal signature. Heat signatures can develop from dozens of natural causes: ground composition, moisture, trapped air. Nothing about a thermal anomaly demands anything unusual. But thermal imaging on its own can't tell you why something is warm. It can only tell you that it is. That's exactly why the team didn't stop there. They wanted to see whether anything else lined up with it. And the EEG dropouts. Wireless equipment loses connection all the time for reasons as mundane as a battery, a firmware quirk, or interference from nearby electronics. That's a legitimate, ordinary answer, except the team didn't accept it after the first failure. They swapped hardware and ran it again, because a real scientist doesn't ask, could this be ordinary? They ask, does it stay ordinary the second time? Notice what Travis never does in any of this. He doesn't rank these observations by how strange they feel. He asks a much narrower question. Does the combined weight of everything recorded justify sending a team back out there? Every time, so far, the answer has been yes. Not because anyone found proof, because the uncertainty never fully closed. And that distinction, investigating because questions remain open, not because an answer has been found, might be the part of this story that says more about Homestead Two than any single reading ever could. So why does one ordinary looking homestead keep showing up at the center of Skinwalker Ranch's investigations? Not because anyone proved something impossible. That answer would be simpler and honestly less interesting. It's because every time this investigation seemed to reach a stopping point, something small forced it back open. A routine baseline check that should have closed out clean but didn't. A second visit prompted by nothing more than an unanswered question. Then an unrelated excavation project that, for no planned reason, kept circling back to the same coordinates. Eventually, 5 independent systems, RF, thermal, EEG, LiDAR, high-speed cameras, all running at once, all watching the same ground. At no point did any of that produce a single, clean answer. What it produced was harder to ignore, a pattern of investigations that kept generating new questions faster than old ones could be closed. That's a different kind of mystery than most people expect walking into this story. It's not one signal. It's not one hotspot on a thermal camera. It's not one dropped connection on an EEG headset. It's that none of those things on their own ended the investigation. And together, they never let it rest either. Maybe geology explains part of it. Maybe equipment behavior explains another part. Maybe something about that location genuinely hasn't been identified yet. Right now, no single theory accounts for everything on the record. And until one does, until someone produces an explanation that survives the same scrutiny Travis applied to every reading before it, Homestead Two stays exactly where it's been for years. Under observation, unresolved. And for reasons still being tested, impossible to walk away from.